So what is the Sabbath then? We know that God's rest on the seventh day became the basis for the Sabbath. What is it that people are actually celebrating when they observe the Sabbath in the Old Testament? The first is they are celebrating and giving thanks to God's provision of good for his people. This is rooted in Genesis 1, but then you see it expressed in the book of Exodus in another way. So in Genesis chapter 1, like I said, what are the two things that happen in Genesis 1 for the sake of human beings? God conquered and banished the darkness and chaos, and he richly provided an extravagantly fruitful world for them. Yes? So, for example, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 30, God says, to every beast of the earth and every bird of the heavens and everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food, and it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, all the host of them, and God rested from his work. So what is it that God has done? He's created a very good world. And the language of good and very good in Genesis 1 really comes right on down to what is good for humans. Every good that God creates is good in that context, partially at least, because it is good for the thriving and well-being of humans. Genesis 1 pictures God as the one who knows what is good for his people and lavishly provides it. We see this exact theme show up in the book of Exodus. So Exodus 16, and this is actually the first Sabbath, the first time Sabbath is mentioned as a practice that Israel is to perform. And in the context here of Exodus 16, what's happened is the people of Israel have come out of Egypt, and now they're moaning and groaning about not having what they want to eat. And they're saying, God has led us out in the desert to kill us. He wanted to lead us out from slavery only to kill us slowly by starvation in the desert. It's a rather unflattering view of God. Now, side note here, how many times have you thought in your life, I know God's brought me this far, but he's brought me this far just to bail on me, and everything's going to go sideways now. Now, you'd never say it like that. You'd never say it like that because you are more put together in your conception of how you're supposed to say things than that. And so you would never say it. But somewhere lurking in your soul is this idea that, like, yes, God's been faithful to me so far, but today might be the day that he just pulls it all out from under me and lets me crash. And you think, no, that's far be it from us to believe that. Yes, far be it from us to believe that. And also, if you're honest, you do. In certain dark moments of the soul, when you're worried and you're hearing Jesus say, don't be anxious about what you eat or drink, or about what you wear, or about where you're going to live, about the roof over your head, about your well-being. Don't worry about that. And you're like, yeah, I know, but I'm worried. And somewhere lurking in your soul is that voice that's telling you that God is not trustworthy, that he can't be trusted to give you what you need when you need it, always, forever. So that's Israel. They come out, they're in the desert, and they're saying God's going to kill us. So then God says, I'm going to give you quail, so much quail, you're going to be sick of quail. And also, I'm going to give you manna. And you're like, what is manna? That's what it is. Hebrew word just means, what is it? That's what manna means. Manna, what is it? We don't know. It's manna. That's what it is. Some kind of little like wafer toast bread thing. And it comes down from heaven every day. Now, what they're told is, only gather what you need for today. Now, why would God do that? Because what are you going to do? You're going to buy every roll of toilet paper in the whole doggone place. So you're going to hoard it, you nasty hoarders. And God knows that's not new. You guys think the toilet paper crisis of 2020 was new? It's not new. They're going to hoard the manna. They don't even know what it is, but they're going to hoard it. And so God says, just gather enough for today. Each person as much as it. Don't gather it more because it's going to spoil by the morning. Well, those morons, they gathered more anyways. And what happened? The next morning, it's got worms in it. Now, then inexplicably, God gives this instruction, that on the sixth day, they need to gather double. And you're thinking, wait a second, every other day, if we gather double, it goes bad and it spoils. But on the sixth day, God says, gather double. Now, why? Here we find Exodus chapter 16 and verse 22. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each, that much. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, this is what Yahweh has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till morning. Wait a second, I thought it would go bad and spoil. Nope. So they laid it aside till the morning as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you will gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none. So Israel was to gather only what they needed for each day, but not on the seventh day. On the seventh day, they don't need to gather anything. God would see to it that what they had gathered on the sixth day would last. And to rest on the seventh day was an act of faith and thanksgiving in God's provision. Now, do you see the connection between Genesis 1 and Exodus 16? Genesis 1 is all about God creating a world in which he has richly provided everything that humans need to thrive. And then part of the relationship that we are created to have with God is that we are to rest and trust in that. And then in Exodus 16, God is saying, I am going to lead you into a land flowing with milk and honey. That's a land a lot like Eden, by the way. And he says that I will richly provide for you everything you need. But you have to trust me. So the act of resting was, number one, a symbol of trusting and giving thanks to God for his provision. Yes? Curiously, though, in Deuteronomy chapter 5, which is the second time in the Bible that we see the 10 Commandments. One time we see it in Exodus 20, and then again they show up in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Now, why is that? Because in Deuteronomy, Moses is speaking to a new generation of Israelites. Between Exodus and Deuteronomy, you have the people of Israel that just decide to go crazy. And they don't trust God, and they want to go back to Egypt, and they attempt a coup on Moses. And so God says, I'm not letting you guys in. You're an unfaithful, hard-hearted, stiff-necked generation. You're all going to die in the wilderness, and the next generation, the children that you thought were going to go into slavery, they are going to inherit the promised land. Okay, so that next generation has sins of the father become inflicted on the sons. What is that? Well, these idiot fathers made their decisions, and now the kids have to wander the desert for 40 years. An 11-day road trip becomes a 40-year camping trip because of the decisions of mom and dad. So now this new generation arrives, and Moses re-gives them the law, and it's called the book of Deuteronomy. So in the book of Deuteronomy, we have the commandment to observe the Sabbath, but notice what it's tied to in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day, it is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner who's within your gates, that your male and servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. And then look what this is connected to here. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So there, the Sabbath is not connected most directly to God's rest on the seventh day. It's connected to Israel's slavery in Egypt. Now, why is that? Because for 400 years, the people of Israel were pressed into hard service in the land of darkness. and God redeemed them. He delivered them out of the house of slavery. And he says to them then, I am going to give you rest instead of anxious, hard labor. In Egypt, they have hard labor in the house of slavery. But God will take them out of that, and he will give them rest. So there, the Sabbath takes on a second deep meaning. And it's not just a celebration of God's provision of everything that we need. It then becomes also a celebration and thanksgiving to God because he has rescued us from the house of slavery. And when I take a day to rest then, if I'm an ancient Israelite, I take that day to rest exactly to remember that were it not for the grace of God, I would still be in the house of slavery. But he has given me rest. Thirdly, it's not just, the Sabbath was not just to remember God's provision of everything that they needed. And it was not just to remember that God had brought them out of the house and land of slavery, but it was also a future signpost. In Exodus chapter 33, after the golden calf incident, Moses is concerned that God is not, in fact, going to go with his people into the land that he promised to give them. And so Moses has this conversation with God where he says, if you're not going to go with me, I'm not doing it. Because this whole thing is sunk if you're not with us. And God says, I'll go with you. And notice what God says to Moses, Exodus 33 and verse 14. He said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you what? I will give you rest. Canaan, again, was the land flowing with milk and honey, the land like Eden, the place in which Israel could thrive without the anxious and painful toil of trying to exact a drop of water from the desert. And so here you have then three major themes attached to Israel's practice of the Sabbath. One was, we practice the Sabbath because we give thanks and trust in God's provision for us, what we need when we need it. Yes? 2, we observe the Sabbath to remember that God has redeemed us from the house of slavery. 3, we observe the Sabbath because God is leading us somewhere. He is leading us to the land of promise. So true rest, true Sabbath for the people of Israel comes from trusting God in these three major